The climate conversation has never been more divided. As disruptors in this space, we're hungry to find solutions to the challenges our environment faces. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. My name is Joel Caesar. I'm joined by Owen Barrett and Chris Pomerleau. We are experts in clean energy, net zero real estate, decarbonization, and entrepreneurship. We celebrate those who take action against the climate crisis and are striving to make the world a cleaner place. Thanks for joining the conversation. Now, let's get to work. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. Joining me as always is Owen Barrett, self-proclaimed Adam Newman of Green Building. Of course, my name is Joel Caesar, the world's greatest climate podcast host. Today's guest is Nizar Delbani. He's the managing partner at Doomsday, a real estate and renewable energy company that acquires and converts commercial real estate in the heavy and light industrial sector of the market to net zero. He is an economist, activist, and renewable energy mogul, and truly is a rebel in the clean energy space. So, man, he was a cool guest. When we first thought about doing the podcast, and, I'm in the world of deep sustainability. I got lots of cool people in my Rolodex that we've been trying to bring into the show, and they've all been awesome, and we got more coming. But I was really excited at people like him who, he's just some guy I found on Twitter who's out there taking action at scale. He's raising money from people in the Middle East, and he's doing agrivoltaics, and he's buying huge commercial properties and converting them to net zero. And, we talk about it all the time. We want to celebrate the doers and the people taking action and the entrepreneurs. And this guy is all of those things and so articulate and so knowledgeable. So I think out of all of our guests, if you're watching the show or interested in listening to the show because you're trying to learn about how you can get into the field of renewable energy meeting real estate, this was a great guest.
Yeah, I mean, it's so refreshing to talk to someone else that's just fed up with the lack of action and just says, I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to raise the money from the Middle East. I'm going to buy the real estate. I'm going to buy the land. I'm just going to build it and do it because it's not happening fast enough. So I thought it was a really refreshing conversation.
Yeah, exactly what we also say all the time. This is a pretty simple business model to execute.
Yeah.
You
just got to do it faster.
Doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, but before we get into Nizar, let's dive into a segment we're going to call, I guess it's Science Corner. We're always borrowing bits from the All In podcast, so this is a version of it, and I think it's just capitalizing on what's in the news right now. So I will probably sort of butcher this. I consider myself a science expert, but not to this extent. We're going to talk about this LK99 superconductor story that is taking the internet by storm. And again, we on this podcast try to bring these wonky, big sustainability climate topics in an approachable manner. So I guess I'm going to try to do this with LK99 and this advanced physics conversation. But essentially, there's people on the internet who think they've discovered a new material that has the ability to carry electricity at room temperature with zero resistance. And it's apparently holy grail of physics and material and energy, because historically, to move electricity and move electrons through the materials we use today, copper being one of the main ones, there's resistance, it creates heat. And to move mass scale electricity or computing electrons through some earth-based material creates a lot of heat and has to be done at super low temperatures, meaning it costs a lot of money to keep all those places cool. Large data centers around the world are really hard to operate and very energy intensive, mainly because they're trying to keep themselves cool all the time. So hopefully that was a good enough explanation of this, and I would encourage anyone who hasn't heard about this to look into it, LK99. And maybe I won't talk more about it unless you think you can improve upon that. But I guess the conversation I want to have with you here is about, especially if you listen to the guys on the All In talk about it, because Friedberg is just this incredibly articulate and intelligent nerd about science. But it's this idea that what this could unlock, if this is true, if we found a superconductor with pretty readily available materials on Earth that can move these electrons around at room temperature, this unlocks the flying car. This unlocks vehicles moving down the road over magnets and having zero friction. This unlocks unlimited battery storage of clean energy. And so there's just a mindset of abundance. I think in the early days of nuclear, people were thinking, wow, look what we discovered, this new material that we can create crazy amounts of energy from. What's that going to do to the future of human society? So I'll stop talking, let you react to what we're learning.
Well,
here.
You basically took all my talking points that I was going to say, so I don't have much to say. I think for me, the big thing is, we society have had superconductive materials before, But to your point, it's always had to been super, like really cold. So it hasn't been practical in the real world. You can't have superconductivity that has to be whatever, negative 100 degrees and have it in the real world. Doesn't make sense. So I think about, transportation, I think about energy, and then I guess storage is sort of a part of energy, but transportation, I mean, look at everything that's happening with EVs now. What if we make the leap from EVs to floating cars? And how little energy. I mean, if there's no resistance, you would basically need almost zero energy to go from point to point, which would be
Yeah.
crazy. Then on the storage front or the energy front, having zero line loss in transmission and distribution lines. That would, I mean, granted, you would have to rebuild all transmission and distribution lines, which would take a long time and cost a lot of money. But when you finally did it, you'd have perfectly efficient transmission and distribution. You would have no losses of energy through that process. So you would need far less generation, which is huge. And then on the storage side, I mean, imagine, I can't even really wrap my head around what that means, that you could pack unlimited amounts of energy into a battery. Like I physically can't wrap my head around that, but just think about what that would do for the storage industry. Like instead of having these massive utility scale storage facilities that are huge, you could have the same thing, but a much smaller footprint, much less materials. A lot of the pushback that I get from the Tin Hat crew on social media is, well, what about the environmental impacts of mining and blah blah
Yeah,
blah.
rare
And
earth
some
minerals.
of
Yeah.
exactly some of that's true, but if you had superconductivity, you would need far less materials, I think, to
Yeah.
store the same amount of energy. So, I mean, overall, it's, I think, all good. I think there's still, the jury's still out in terms of whether or not it's real or not. But I mean, man, we could see some crazy changes in our lifetime because of this.
Yeah, and I think a message maybe I'd love to leave us with here is if you do the math of trying to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming, which is what the IPCC is advocating we do to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change, it can be daunting. It's hard to be optimistic when you look at the math, like the trend of where we're going with emissions and how what we have to do to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius looks very challenging. Now we're always here talking. There's a way, and we got to mass deploy at scale what we have, the technology available today. But there's also, you should have hope. Everyone should have hope because there will be these crazy breakthroughs in science of things we can't even imagine that are going to help us get there. So that's why those of us in the time we're acting now have to do everything we can. It's kind of like buying us time for the researchers and the experts and the innovators out there to figure this stuff out before we reach some tipping point that we can't come back from.
Yeah, I think the only other point is we don't know when those breakthroughs are going to happen or how long it's going to take to actually implement the tech once it's discovered. So we do have to act now because we can't just hope that there's some silver bullet 5 years from now that like rids us of all emissions or does everything needed. So I agree, like it helps you stay optimistic and hopeful, but we can't take our eye off of having like massive immediate action right now because that's what's needed right now and that's what we have to do right now.
Well, now we know you can come to the Climate Rebels podcast to get your education on solid state physics breakthroughs. But
Add another one to the
until next
box.
time. But now let's jump into our conversation with Nizar Delbani. Nizar Delbani is the managing partner at Doomsday, a real estate and renewable energy company that acquires and converts commercial real estate in the heavy and light industrial sector of the market to net zero. He and the team focus on reducing the negative impact of high power consuming industrial properties by reducing their consumption, then offsetting it using proprietary and innovative software and hardware solutions. Nizar and his team believe it is time for a shift in the paradigm to make renewable energy our source of power. He is an economist, activist, and renewable energy mogul. So, Nizar, welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast.
Thank you for having me, Joel. I really appreciate being here, and it's exciting what you guys are doing. I, identify with everything that you guys are building here, so happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you. We know you're a rebel. So, on that note, if you're a fan of the show, we always like to start with the same question. How are you, a climate rebel?
Well, that is a very great question. And every time I hear people's answers, I'm like, man, I want to have a cool answer like that, but maybe I don't have one, right? But the real answer here is that in regards to everything that I've done in my career, in my life, I've always seen myself as the underdog, as the rebel, as the guy coming up against the evil empire, right? And so that's kind of my philosophy on things, and especially being in the industry for renewables, for diversity, and kind of changing things. That's really where my, I guess, rebelism comes from. Being somebody who's against the oil and gas industry, for example, especially with my ties to the Middle East, since that's where I'm from. It's kind of, weird where, an Arab who's benefiting from the oil and gas side of things on one end, and then coming here and saying, no, we don't want that. We want to focus on renewables, deploying this, kind of building all these agrivoltaic solar farms, and as well as the net zero property conversions that we're doing on the commercial side of things. So that kind of hand in hand, it's very different, as well as the fact that I've always taken the rebels approach, even with everything that I'm doing on the private equity side of things, where I'm of unconventional fund manager, and it's very different for them to see. So shout out to the guys over at the Wall Street Rebels. That's kind of another reason why I identify with the climate rebel side of things.
Yeah, well, you're using a lot of our favorite words: unconventional, rebel, taking down the evil empire, underdog.
Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
all things we here at Raven truly align with. I'll kick us off here. I know Owen's got a ton of questions, but I became a fan of yours through Twitter. This is the first time we met. This is one of the cool things about hosting a podcast. I watched this guy. I never knew him before, and you're posting really cool content about what you're doing. Very open about your business model and some of your successes and challenges. So someone like me who's out there looking to learn from renewable energy real estate entrepreneurs, you're a great follow. So so many questions here, but let's start with something you just mentioned. You come from an oil and gas family. It's our understanding. We did some homework on you before the show, and you just talked
Nice.
about how there's some
Hmm.
rebelliousness in
Mm.
what you've chosen to do with your life compared to your family background. So yeah, maybe we start there. How's that been?
Yeah.
How'd that come about? And how's that going with your family ties?
That's right. Yeah. So, it has been something of a stringent relationship. There are a lot of I'm not going to say negative feelings. It's more of, we're on opposite sides of the table. And we're trying to come together to make something better, right? And being from somewhere in the Middle East that they're pumping out a bunch of oil all the time, trying to continue to export that, and the large impact that that does on the world, it makes me feel like now I have to do something on my end to kind of combat that, to kind of, compensate for what has been done, I guess, not from a reparation standpoint, but more from a perspective of, okay, we made a ton of money here. It's something that has been beneficial from a financial perspective, but now how do we use those finances, and how do you use that capital to fix or improve or kind of make things better ultimately for the future, right? Oil and gas had its time. It's necessary. It's a necessary thing that we've had to use, and I'm not somebody to say, yeah, you want to shut down oil and gas tomorrow. No, I don't think that that's a smart thing to do, but we do need to move forward and apply renewables into what we're doing and continue to have that be the focus, while reducing and limiting the amount of gas and oil that we're exporting and putting into the environment.
Right on.
I feel like you're ahead of your time. I feel like there's going to be this epiphany in the Middle East where it's like, all right, our time here with oil is coming to a close. Let's shift all our money into renewables because that's going to be that's a future. So maybe you're just sort of whatever that term is. You're the
Hmm.
Robin
A,
of
a
the Middle East.
trailblazer is what they
Yeah,
like to say.
yeah, exactly.
But yeah, no, it's very interesting because every time I have conversations with people there who are in the industry, they're all telling me the same things. That we're looking at getting into alternative investments. We're trying to deploy capital into renewables. Like, it's just unbelievable how much the shift is happening, and it's happening in front of my eyes. Like, before last year we were doing some interesting things down there, and people were looking at investing into alternative investments in the States. But then with everything that was happening with the Inflation Reduction Act and how things were going, we said, hey, let's take a pause. Let's see what happens, what ends up going on with the legislation in and what that does for the industry in the States. And then we'll talk about what you guys can deploy into there, because everybody's trying to get a foot ahead of the curve, like you said, Owen, and be more invested into the space because they see that eventually it's going there. They can't fight it. And so that's the sentiment that I'm getting from people down there.
Yeah. We talk about the IRA all the time. We talked about it on the last podcast. What are you guys doing to sort of get positioned and ready for when all the rebates and incentives are available?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we're doing, and the team is amazing, and our analysts and everybody who's on the financial side, as well as the deployment side and operations are focused on trying to maximize everything. Because as you know, there's the base credit that you would get, and then you kind of have to hit certain metrics in order for you to qualify for the higher credits. And the way that I've always been explaining this to people that really don't understand the capacity and what this really is and how this can benefit them, the fact of the matter is that the government is basically giving people a 70% LTV if you hit the max, obviously, but it's giving the people a 70% LTV loan at a 0% interest to go and build and deploy into renewables in specific geographies with low income, for example, being targeted in terms of the power being sold to those areas, etc. And so what that does in an environment that we're in today, like the debt environment that has skyrocketed in terms of the rates and everything that does, it causes deals to pencil when they didn't pencil in the past. It opens up doors and opportunities that did not exist. And so when I frame the thing to people that way, they look back and I'm sure you guys understand the same thing in terms of Raven and how you guys are building it, and where, when you want to do an improvement and you're getting a 50% credit on the improvement side of things, and specifically in multifamily, you got Section 45L, you got Section 179D, you can combine it with 48C, all of that, well, 48. And you can combine it with all that, and that just improves your numbers dramatically. And so we take all of that and we deploy it into everything that we can and try to maximize as much. But in our models, we base out a 40-50%. Really, we don't really hit the 70% because we try to be conservative in our modeling.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's awesome.
Yeah, Nizar, another theme, as Owen mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act has come up a lot with various guests here, and the other theme I want to touch on, though, is this transition. You said, I don't think it's a good idea to shut down oil and gas tomorrow. And one of the themes we try to celebrate here is that this is a big tent effort right now to decarbonize the world's economy. And we can't be fighting amongst each other, and we can't be pointing fingers. And you're in the Middle East working with the major oil and gas producers, trying to transition their revenues, their money, their business models. And of course, there's a lot of opportunities to do that here in the States too. And that's just, I'm sure you're going to agree. I'm just maybe making the point that we all need to celebrate this. And I feel like, who was the recent guest where we talked about this a lot? Like, it will be a transition. We're not against each other, and that's
right.
Okay. We gotta exist in this gray area, but we need people like
do.
you, people like Raven out there saying, we're going to build new business models that are capitalizing on this incredible opportunity. And at the same time, we're going to work with the legacy energy industries that have done a lot for the development of humankind to transition them forward.
That's right. That's right. And so, and that's how we have to look at it. A lot of people in the climate space, unfortunately, are looking at their predecessors as their enemies. And I don't look at them that way. I look at them as my partners. I look at them as people who they did what they could at that time with the information and the resources that they had. And they deployed in that space. Now they're realizing that, okay, maybe it wasn't the best idea to deploy in the way that we did, but we have to now fix whatever happened, right? And so we have to try and improve upon what we've done. And that's where, that merge happens. You have to have both come into play, and it would be a dumb idea tomorrow to shut down all oil pipelines, to shut down everything that has to do with fossil fuels. It's not going to happen. And for that to happen, it would cause catastrophe. So you do have to go about it in a strategic way, and it has to be smart. And so that's where it comes, where we have this transition come into play, where we're coming in and we're getting oil and gas money to go and deploy into renewables. And if you can see with the trend, that's really what's happening. A lot of the older energy tycoons, or these massive conglomerates, they're starting to push into that region. And so it has to go that way. So I completely agree with you. And whoever was on the show that said something similar, they're on the right track.
Yeah, and I mean, Owen, you can speak to this too. Owen and I, with our Raven business model, we're trying to raise money from lots of people for smaller
Hmm.
amounts, and we're having lots of
Hmm.
conversations with those people. And um, we get the question a lot: how are you guys? Because our projections are promising certain returns to those investors, and so you get the
Yeah.
question of, "Hey, interest rates, we're all paying attention. This is crazy. Are you sure you're going to be able to buy buildings and hit your target returns?" And
Hmm.
of course, it's nuanced. You're in real estate, and you're in lots of places, so not every answer is the same depending on which market, which asset type. But the answer that you just said, I'll paraphrase of, sure, look, if you're a traditional real estate business model and just doing kind of traditional value add, trying to raise revenue through increased rents,
Yes.
that seems challenging right now in this environment.
Very challenging.
But if
Very
you can take
challenging. Yeah.
advantage of everything the government is doing right now, especially from the Inflation Reduction Act to incentivize clean energy, then that makes a lot of opportunities that otherwise might not seem appetizing look pretty promising.
I think the other thing too on that note is, I don't think today there's a lot of data to suggest that a net zero building will trade at a lower cap rate than sort of a similar building that's more conventional, not net zero. But I would guarantee my net worth that in 10 to 20 years, these buildings will trade at lower cap rates. So I think if you're, modeling out a 10-year hold, 15-year hold, I think you should mess around with a sensitivity analysis of what happens if your cap rate isn't 6%, it's 5.5%, because you have a net zero building and traditional buildings are trading at 6 caps. So I think
Hmm.
we're at this like inflection point of when there's going to be more value put on net zero buildings when they trade. I don't think we're there quite yet, but I do see that in the next 10 to 20 years.
I completely agree with you. Give it a couple decades and that will happen. The compression has to happen, and that's in my opinion because the value is just apparently there.
Yeah.
And so what that is going to do is it is going to translate into what they trade at, and how they are being bought. So the value is going to be significant. And specifically to what you were saying, Joel, like the traditional, real estate guy who's trying to make a deal pencil with just being able to add some value through raising rents, or improving certain things in terms of the living conditions, that's great, and I think it would work, in terms of a just trying to do some kind of a core improvement, things like that. But it's not going to give you those massive increases in value that people have been used to, that they've been seeing over the 2021, 2022 periods, and historically, right? So, but when you can come in and you can take a fixed expense and eliminate that expense and draw all that back into your NOI, that is just unbelievable. Like, you look at a building that has $1 million power cost, and you can say, okay, if I deploy X amount of dollars into a solar system with a new HVAC, I improve the roof, I do some kind of building envelope to reduce to improve the insulation, all this kind of stuff, and then now that NOI all goes back into the $1 million all goes back into my NOI at a 6 cap, at a 5 cap, whatever that might be. That value creation there is unheard of, and it's done like that. You don't have to sit and wait 2, 3, 4 years for that to happen. It's a 6 to 12 month period to get that construction completed. So, and it's an instantaneous draw into your NOI. So that's what I love about it. And for us, we model cap rates, and for sensitivity perspective, we don't really reduce it. The way that I'm looking at it is I'm just saying, okay, worst case scenario, cap rates remain the same and they don't go down, even though I expect them to, but they don't go down. What am I going to exit at? And still the numbers are phenomenal.
I've been telling Owen about you for a while. I'm like, this guy on Twitter is just out there basically celebrating our business model and talking all about net zero and how
Yeah.
we're adding value because of the NOI impact. So great to have you,
You know what's
Nizar.
crazy? I came up on Raven on Instagram before I even spoke to you, or before you reached out to me. So I was like, these guys are doing something great. I like it.
Oh, look at that. We see you.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
working.
Real
You're
recognizes
targeting the
real
right
there.
people. You're
Yeah.
targeting the right people. Yeah.
Well, let me respond to your answer there. I want to do two things real quick here. I want to make fun of Owen first, and then I want one of you to do some education here for the audience on cap rates. So let's make fun of Owen first. Um, Nizar, we like to frame ourselves as the climate podcast version of the All In podcast. Do you listen to that show?
Got it. Yeah, I do.
And so, Chamath, well, Owen's favorite,
Yep.
he's always out there. He's willing to make a bet on live in the
I
podcast.
know.
Calls
Yeah.
himself a betting man. So I think we should. Owen just said he would guarantee his net worth that net
Mm.
zero buildings would be lower cap rate in the future. Should we put him on the spot
Well,
like
for
a
the
la
record, I said
Chamath?
10 to 20 years.
10 to 20 years, and
Rewind the
he's
tape.
guaranteeing his. Is he guaranteeing his net worth today or his net worth in 10 to 20 years? Because
I'm
that
guaranteeing my
matters.
net worth today that in 10 to 20 years,
Oh,
you'll see lower cap rates on net zero buildings than equivalent non-net zero buildings.
got it.
Well,
Okay.
I don't think you'll find Nizar and I taking that bet because I think we're
I will
on your
not.
side. But if anyone
Yeah.
out there in the audience who wants to take Owen's bet, reach out to us. Invest at joinraven.com, and
Hmm.
we can put Owen's net worth on the table. All right. My second piece
Uh,
was I want some education, right? You both are talking cap rates. Not everyone understands that term. So maybe Owen, let's ask you. Describe what you meant by the lower cap rate for a net zero building.
So the way that value is derived in commercial real estate is you take net operating income, which is kind of like net profit, and you divide it by a cap rate, which is basically the unlevered return. So if you were to buy a $100,000 property, all cash, and it gave you $5,000 per year in cash in your pocket, that would be a 5 cap. So my point is, when you model out a hold period for a certain property, you have to look at what your going in cap rate is today. And then you
So
have
in that case, it was 5%. You were buying something that was already producing 5%.
Well, but usually you look at it on a levered basis because there's debt in the equation. But yeah, so you look at what your going in cap rate is, and then, before the sort of debt market exploded, a lot of multifamily syndicators were assuming like a 5 basis point per year increase in cap rate. Does that make sense?
Yep, I'm following.
So now I would say it's more like 10 basis points, maybe 15. So you take what you think your NOI will be in 10 years and you divide it by what you think your cap rate will be in 10 years. And that's what you should be able to sell your property for in 10 years. My point is, if you have two identical buildings, but one is net zero and one is not, I think that the net zero building will trade for a lower cap rate than the non-net zero building because it will be more in demand by buyers.
You agree, Nizar? Good explanation.
I completely agree, and that's a great explanation for how cap rates work and the compression versus expansion of those cap rates. Many people don't really understand, and I'm glad that you guys did mention that to explain what that really is. So, and that's a very real estate-y term, and in terms of how we look at things on the renewable energy side, it's, we look more on like EBITDA and NOI, multiples, things like that. But when it comes to real estate, yeah, it's all about the cap rate. I bought a $10 million property, it's shooting out $500,000. That means, I'm making it 5%.
Well, we're on net zero. Let's transition to your company, Doomsday, shaking up the real estate space.
Mm,
Looks like you call yourself Rebels with Clean Energy, so we love that. But let's talk about
yeah.
the holistic approach to net zero with Doomsday, and maybe
Hmm.
describe where you guys are at in the
Great.
evolution of the business.
Perfect. So I started Doomsday about 5, 6 years ago, and it was after I decided that I wanted to get into the private equity space because I saw the impact that it could do to what we were building. And I historically been in many different businesses. My family has operated in electronic and electrical systems, components, accessories, business, manufacturing, and distribution for decades. And so that was one of the things that we have become famous for in the Middle East, actually. And so after, years and years of things going well, and, then, you had things go wrong in the economy in the States with my father and everything that they had built. Um, they transitioned to a few different things, one of which was deploying into the energy efficiency space. And so that drew into the renewable energy space. And when I was in Guangzhou, China, I lived there for some time, and I really started understanding how they were doing things. And I saw solar everywhere there. And so they were very heavy into that. I was in the Canton Fair, I remember. And in the Canton Fair, that's where I stumbled upon the industry, and I said, "This is something that I need to bring to the United States because I see this nowhere in the States." And so that's really how my start happened into renewables. But then fast forward a few years later, which was about six years ago, I started into private equity, built Doomsday, and have been building since then. Right now, we're actually the focus and the mission for Doomsday is to combat Doomsday-like climate change scenarios. That's the goal and the mission. And so I've built an amazing team over the years, brought in different people who have skill sets that I don't have, to be able to improve on everything that we're doing. And so, my partners in there, they are all amazing, phenomenal people, and they bring in extremely high value. Um, from fund, setup, as well as, the investor relations, deployment, build out, system integration, all of that, even the knowledge of agrivoltaics and net zero. Because really, Doomsday has like a two-pronged approach to how we deal with things. Is we focus on targeting the agricultural industry as well as the real estate industry, and that's how we focus on trying to decarbonize, right? And so when it comes to agriculture, we deploy into agrivoltaic farms that, obviously, I'm sure everybody's seen what a solar farm looks like, or if you haven't, take a look at it. It's basically a big plot of land that you have a bunch of solar panels on top of that are low profile, close to the ground. And what that does, it eventually, I found a problem with how it's killing land, or not really killing it, but it's underutilizing it. And so I found a way to say, hey, why don't we do something different? Why don't we come in, deploy a strategy to multi-yield land compared to what people traditionally have been doing? And so what we did is we partnered with a few different organizations, where we come in, we build a raised profile off of the ground, 10, 14 feet sometimes, where we put the solar panels on top of that with, tracking technology to improve yield as well, and bifacial modules. That helps us with what we're doing. And then we grow crop underneath the modules. And because of the bifaciality and the fact that we can tilt the modules, and we use AI to actually take a look at the sensors on the ground to say, hey, what is the required sunlight on this piece of plot, or this crop? And once it hits that required irradiance, it blocks the sun again. And so that helps with the yield of the farm, helps with the yield for the solar as well, and helps with multi-yielding land so that it's not, being wasted. And so that was one approach. And then we took the net zero approach as well on the real estate side with the commercial and industrial deployment into, heavy power consuming properties, cold storage, data centers, mining facilities, manufacturing facilities. That's kind of our approach. You guys went the more traditional multifamily route, which is definitely high demand and actually has the best results in my opinion. But I prefer to stick within my lane of what I know how to do.
So are you guys buying the real estate and decarbonizing it, or are you just focused on the decarbonization?
So we acquire and decarbonize.
Perfect. Cool.
Yeah.
What does a portfolio look like these days?
So we're actually in the middle of a raise right now, and I not to go into too many details, but hopefully by end of year we'll be around 1.4, 1.5 billion AUM.
And is that all over the world? Is that in the States?
So that's globally and in the States. So that's kind of the direction that we are most likely going to be going in. Some of the funds that we have deployed in the past have been global, in the Middle East, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, Lebanon, Syria, that area. And then now in the States, we're continuously deploying with the newest fund that we have, some of which are going to be opportunity zones, some of which are going to be just traditional deployment into the real estate.
And how many of these agrivoltaic deployments do you have? I find this fascinating. I mean, if anyone who's paying attention to climate or sustainability or solar and reading the news, you see
Hmm.
the promise and the theory of it. And I know there's been some deployment and lots of really solid information about how it actually improves crop yield if you do it correctly, which sounds like you're doing using
Yes.
artificial intelligence. But
Hmm.
yeah, how long ago did you get into that? How much deployment do you have?
First one, yeah. So the first one we did was probably 4 or 5 years ago, 4 years ago, around 4 years ago. And the results that we saw at that point in time were just unbelievable. We didn't expect what we expected, and kind of we tied things in with three things. We did the solar, we did the crop, and then we did apiaries. And so we got these large bee farms, right? And we deployed these bee farms around the perimeter where the farm is. Because if you know anything about deploying solar farms, you know that you need to have a specific amount of a setback for from the roads and from like main areas and things like that. And so that was also dead land. And so what we said is, okay, we can use that land to put a bunch of beehives in. And so we just put a bunch of beehives around the perimeter of the farm, which are, feeding from the crop that we have on the actual site, and being able to then make honey and produce a lot of these other resources that we can utilize, but they also improve the yield of the crop. And so putting all of that together was just maximal efficiency for us. And we tinkered around with it in the beginning. We had to improve it and change it. And then we started deploying large scale. We did one pilot. And then over the years now, we've had 15, 16 go up. They got larger and larger as we went along. We started first with a 10-acre piece of land, and then we kind of went over.
So in
So
this
in doing some
scenario, are you the farmer, the utility scale solar? I guess both of those.
So we are not the farmer per se. We partner with farmers, and we take a percentage of the revenue that they generate. So the extra yield, we own the land and we own the asset, and then we allow them to come and farm underneath our panels. We allow them to do all of the required maintenance and everything that goes into that. And what helps with that is the fact that they can cultivate the land due to the fact that it's high above the ground. They can send a excavator under that. They can send a harvester under that, no problem. And it assists with everything that they need to do.
So if you have a 10-acre plot of land or whatever number of acres, is the land making more money off the PPA with the utility or the revenue from the crops that are being grown? Have you looked at it like that?
The highest yield that we get is usually the energy.
Hmm.
So, and it depends actually on geographically where we're doing it, because, let's say in the Northeast right now, where they have higher power costs, they have higher SRECs. So even their state programs, for example, like in DC right now, where you're getting $400 per SREC, which really translates to about 40 cents per kilowatt hour. And that is ridiculous when you look at what that does for you. If you're selling power at 20 cents, 15 cents, and then you're getting 40 cents just from the SREC per kilowatt hour, that just shoots your numbers up like crazy. And so when we build these, we look for areas where we're going to get the maximal financial benefit, as well as maintaining the crop underneath and the growth. Now in the South, and so there's an inverse relationship there, right? Where traditionally farming happens in the South. And so you have more sunlight, but you don't have as many financial incentives for energy, as well as the state renewable energy certificates, or power's cheap, all those things. So there is an inverse relationship there. And so growing crop up north and benefiting from that also helps with diversifying and even decentralizing how the farming industry works.
So in doing some research about you prior to the show, I come across Project Honeycomb. Is that what this is?
That's Project Honeycomb, yes.
Very cool. So
So yeah.
can I buy the honey? Is it like solar branded honey
It
that I
it
can
is
buy?
it is solar. It is Doomsday brand. We are planning on doing something. Well, currently we're selling it in like local farmers markets, and we have a partner who comes in, they harvest, they do everything, and then they sell it under their brand. and then they actually provide us with it's a revenue split essentially. So that's kind of how we do it. But we are looking eventually to do our own branding and have our own products if it makes sense within the business model. I don't like to split myself up too much. What I do, this is how I know how to do it, and I want to keep focus. I don't want to go into too many different things that's going to be spreading me too thin. And so I like to operate in that sense.
Yeah, don't go chasing shiny objects. You're
Shiny
not.
object syndrome. I had that for some time. I had to get rid of it. It was hard.
Yeah, Owen's like that too.
I think I still have it.
If this were Owen, he'd be texting me on his side. He's like, maybe we should start a honey business.
Oh my God.
I tend to stay within the parameters of the built environment, but I definitely get the shiny object syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
We're running out of time here, Nizar, so we might have to move to our wrap-up question. But I wanted to touch, I think another theme to come back to here was you mentioned you lived in China and saw all the solar happening there. And that's related to what we discussed earlier about oil and gas being the enemy, and how in the climate industry we're against each other. And of course, you get that with U.S. versus China. You talk to a climate denier, or maybe just someone who thinks it's pointless for America to act because what about China, right? We always hear that. But I think anyone who's been there, Owen and I met in grad school at UC Santa Barbara. My thesis, actually, we partnered with a group of students at Nanjing University. So I got to go for 10 days and meet with them. And they were working on a lot of the same things we were, net zero buildings, and trying to figure out how to decarbonize their school and the surrounding campus. And I remember thinking, there is so much happening in China. And I think anyone who's paying attention today still sees clean energy deployment is happening crazy at scale. Do they have their challenges with fossil fuel generated energy? Of course. And just because of their scale, then it's going to be a bigger chunk of the world's emissions. But maybe you can elaborate a little bit on your time there and talk about the efforts they're making.
Yeah, so that was the biggest takeaway for me, honestly, when I was living there, is seeing how, you know, effective they were at deploying renewable energy and at realizing that the energy market is something that they need to get a hold on, or else it's going to cripple them. And I can completely agree with the fact that the US needs to look at it like that as well. And instead of trying to combat and fight China from that perspective, we need to actually be following in their footsteps, because they did something that enabled them to have autonomy. They did something that enabled them to not be reliant on somebody else. Today Saudi Arabia goes and says, we're going to reduce supply. We're screwed. And so I was reading something the other day about the reserves in the United States and how they've almost been depleted, and we're in a situation where soon gas prices are going to go up to $8-9 a gallon again, and it's just going to be a bloodbath. And so if we had control over our own energy and control over how things are going, that with renewables, for example, and we had deployed into this years ago or decades ago, then it would, like China did, it would have been a very different thing. And so, regardless of the fact that China does have a very high emissions direction, right? And I mean, they have a very high emissions number. And so, they are definitely one of the worst, or the uncleanest countries in the world, but they also are doing more in terms of deployment. Like today, I read actually that by 10 years from now, China is deploying 100 watts per capita of clean energy every single year for the next 10 years. So 100 watts per capita is massive when you have 2 billion people almost. And so that's going to be something that they are going to be pushing, and they're, obviously very heavily invested into it. And so, I think that we need to do more, and we as a country and as a leader in the world, we need to play our part, and we need to actually be the one to step up and be better than China in this perspective. So, I'm very big on US independence and making sure that we are not reliant on anybody. And so I love what's happening right now with the Inflation Reduction Act and that direction. And that's one of the reasons why we're building out our solar manufacturing facility in Miami. So there's so much that, we have in terms of needing to be independent and pushing our own stuff.
Joel always yells at me for getting political on these podcasts, but I just find it so fascinating that like a net zero economy is the ultimate energy independent economy. And
It
yet
is.
it's been spun into this like crazy world where we can't be energy independent and net zero. We have to be energy independent, yet
That's
dependent
false.
on our own fossil fuels. And we got to get better at marketing as a community.
Yeah,
That
I agree.
keeps coming up too, Joel. We got to figure out how to get the best marketers in the country working on climate change.
Yeah, no doubt. Like that commercial we talked about in our last episode that you sent me. That's targeting, I would guess, red state men to talk about how
Mm,
macho solar is. So we'll send that to you, Nizar. You'll get a kick out of
yeah,
it.
yeah. No, interesting. I think I
Well,
saw it, but yeah.
well, I think sadly we're out of time, Nizar. It's been so fascinating to learn about your journey and your company. We're going to be rooting for you. You got partners here who are going to be sharing each other's stories. So let us know how we can help.
I appreciate that, man. And if there's anything that we can do for you here at Doomsday, we'd love to help. We'd love to participate. Be part of what you guys are building at Raven and the like. So, anything that we can, trade resources. And as I said, I look at everybody as a partner, not really a competitor, not really an enemy. That's how we all need to look at each other and continue to push on. The industry is so massive. There's approximately $20 trillion worth of potential here for everybody to get a piece, and we have to have an abundance mentality. And so that's how I take things. That's how I want others in the industry to see things as well. And that's why I'm so vocal on sharing everything on Twitter, like you mentioned in the beginning. So, and I'm going to continue to do so.
Well, I might have stole your thunder a little bit there. I didn't ask the question. We always wrap up with the same question. It's actually pretty fun this time because your company name is related. We like to say at the last question to our guests here at the Climate Rebels, we like to celebrate optimism, doers, people taking action, and not drown ourselves in the doomsday news cycle. So
Hmm.
you're the head of Doomsday. Tell us what gives you hope about the future.
So Doomsday gives me hope, honestly, because what Doomsday is doing is it is combating that. It is bringing on individuals to continue to combat that negative outlook, that negative, environment that people keep talking about, where it's like, oh, this is all bad, and we're all gonna perish, and it's a nightmare. And okay, yeah, but what are you doing about it? Right? And so that's where Doomsday is focusing. Doomsday is focusing on the biggest problems that we have, and we're targeting those and making sure that we do our part and we continue to deploy and we continue to push capital and resources and everything that we need to improve our infrastructure. And so, I have a lot of hope for the future, for what we are going to be building at Doomsday and to change the narrative. And that's the reason why I actually named the organization Doomsday. It's because it's such a smash in the face. It's such a marketing, advertising, you know,
It's a lightning
powerful
rod. Yeah.
tool, powerful tool that has a negative connotation. But then when you ask, okay, but what do you guys do? We actually combat climate change, doomsday-like climate change scenarios. So that's the effort that we push. And when people listen and they hear that, they're like, wow, that's amazing. And so that for us, we are very hopeful. We're very ecstatic. We see the future, and I'm looking forward to how we can make that a reality.
Well, it's very cool, and it's a similar one of our favorite slogans we use here is "Stop complaining about climate change, do something about it." So
Exactly.
sounds like that's what Doomsday is
I love
about.
it. Yeah.
Well, Nizar, thanks so much for joining. How can our audience find you? What's the Twitter handle? Where's the website?
Yeah, it's doomsdaypartners.com, and you guys can find my Twitter, President Delbani. It's
Is that
pretty
a little
simple to find.
foreshadowing about what's going to happen in the future?
Maybe I don't like to talk about my political campaigns but we'll see.
Breaking news here on the Climate Rebels
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah. I'm not announcing my campaign yet,
Well,
2032.
We expect that this podcast is your platform for announcing.
yes, let's make a
All
deal.
right.
When you go to announce, you have to come here
Okay.
to do the
I
announcement.
have to come here. Oh man, can we at least push it on Twitter so that I get some Elon Musk support?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
we'll figure out how to do that.
we'll
Episode
go
568.
we'll go Twitter live. We'll do it just like he did it with who did he do
Yeah,
that with? DeSantis recently.
DeSantis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right. Well, thank you,
awesome.
Nizar, and we're gonna wrap up here. Thank you everyone for joining. You can find us on most of the social media platforms at Join Raven. So that's Join, and Raven is with a Y, RAYVEN. You can find this podcast and more great content at joinraven.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, like, and share with your friends. And until next time, we encourage you to ask yourself, what are you doing to fight the climate crisis?